Hi everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for our panel discussion. It's entitled The Road to Freedom, the BDS Movement for Palestinian Rights and the Struggle Against Apartheid. So a quick note about us. Tonight's event is hosted by Columbia University Apartheid Divest, which is a joint campaign between Columbia Students for Justice in Palestine and Barnard Columbia Jewish Voice for Peace. We launched last year in February of 2016, and we call upon the university to divest all of its stocks, funds, and endowments from any and all companies that profit from Israeli apartheid, illegal occupation of land, and violation of Palestinian human rights. Our campaign is situated within the global call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, of the State of Israel by Palestinian civil society. So as such, it's our great honor and pleasure to be hosting Omar Barghouti tonight, the co-founder of the BDS movement, alongside Vilkomerson, who is stuck in traffic, and Professor Premilla Nadasen from the Barnard History Department.
CUAD for organizing this event tonight and the student activists for continuing to push on this incredibly important political issue. I'm very humbled and honored to be here today and to share the stage with Omar and with Rebecca, both of whom have really cut their teeth on the issue of Palestine. This is not part of my scholarly expertise, so I'm here to really speak about my moral support for the movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And I want to begin with a bit of autobiography about how I came to this issue, because it's not an issue that people naturally come to, or it's an evolutionary process. I was born and raised in apartheid South Africa, and I left there at the age of 5, but we went back periodically to visit family. And during those trips, I experienced apartheid firsthand. There were incidents of humiliation and confinement. We lived in a segregated Indian township. I recall being refused service in stores, being refused the use of a restroom in downtown Durban. I recall white police officers randomly stopping and searching our cars when my uncles drove me places, and that was purely for the purposes of harassment and intimidation. We had done nothing wrong. And although these incidents infuriated me, they were relatively minor injustices, sort of inconveniences. Because I am of Indian descent, I didn't experience the brunt of apartheid practices. And as a child, there was a great deal that I didn't see. The violence and the dispossession that underpinned the apartheid system was something that I learned about later. Through reading and through talking to my family members. There was the educational deprivation, and my mother, like countless others, had been forced to drop out of school. In fact, you had to pay to go to school, and there were no schools available for people of color after 8th grade. And so she dropped out of school in the 8th grade, and she washed clothes for white families in order to support her family. There were family members and friends who had been detained and tortured by the South African security forces, including one person who came to stay with us when I was in high school here in the US. He had spent 8 years in Robben Island. He had spent 5 years under house arrest. And all of this technically for donating $25 to a so-called subversive organization. He had committed no violent act whatsoever. And I remember speaking to him, and he would always tell me, I was 17 at the time, he said, "You can't sit on my right side. When they tortured me, they broke my eardrum. So you have to sit on my left side." And that's a kind of experience that was very tangible as a 17-year-old. My father's involvement in the anti-apartheid struggle when he was living in South Africa, and the subsequent raid on our home by security forces had a profound effect on the family. My mother was alone with her 3 small children, and as you know, she didn't go to school for very long. And so she was scared out of her mind when one of our relatives called and said, "The security forces are on their way to your house. You need to burn all the literature." My father was out of the country at the time. So she had to gather all this material, and she burned it in the backyard. Those were bad, but the indigenous population experienced so much more. They were denied citizenship, they were denied the right to mobility in the very land of their birth. Apartheid was a system of population management, a system of racial categorization, a system of racial exploitation, a system of land expropriation, a system that enabled a white minority population to wield power over a majority black population and quell any inkling of dissent. It was much more than an inconvenience as I had experienced it. These realities of living under apartheid were enough to prompt my parents to want to flee the country, which we did when my father got an opportunity to study at a university in the US. When I became a teenager, I committed myself to the anti-apartheid movement. I started an anti-apartheid organization at my high school, and when I went to the University of Michigan, I was a part of a group that built makeshift shanties in the Central Quad to highlight the poor housing conditions of black South Africans. We lobbied the university to grant an honorary degree to Nelson Mandela. We pressured the university to divest its holding from the companies that were doing business in South Africa. So we were firm supporters and advocates of the BDS movement in South Africa. And that sanctions and divestment movement is one of the key reasons for the fall of apartheid and the transition to a democratic system in 1994. For activists there was really no symbol of racist oppression that was more compelling. There was no issue that stirred more moral outrage than the issue of South Africa throughout the 1970s and the 1980s. At the same time, as opponents of apartheid, we were in a minority. Contrary to popular misconceptions, which is often driven by hindsight, the boycott of South Africa in the 1980s was not a popular strategy. Mandela was on the US terrorist watch list until 2008, and the University of Michigan absolutely refused to grant him an honorary degree because he was a terrorist. So we held our own alternative graduation ceremony in defiance of the university. While many people thought apartheid was wrong, very few believed that divestment was the right approach. Our shanties on campus were routinely attacked, defaced, torn down, burned. We were taunted and heckled on a daily basis. And every time our shanties were torn down, what did we do? We rebuilt them, and we were not deterred. The South African BDS movement was not driven by people at the top or people in power. It was driven by grassroots groups around the world who mobilized to show our support for the internal movement in South Africa that was advocating for a free and democratic society. Since my anti-apartheid days, intersectionality, social justice, and social movements have really been at the center of my scholarship. So I bring to my understanding of what's happening in Palestine a lifetime of social justice work and engagement with grassroots organizing. In 2001, I went on a delegation with 10 other women of color to Palestine. Our delegation included indigenous women, African Americans, Filipino women, Palestinian American women, and as well as women of Indian descent. With the exception of one person, no delegation members were experts on the Middle East, and none of us had ever visited the region before. We embarked on this trip in part because we wanted to think about global feminist solidarities. We met with women and feminist groups in Palestine, but we also examined the broader issues of occupation, militarization, and resistance movements in Palestine through an indigenous, transnational, women of color feminist lens. That is, we brought with us an intersectional analysis that was the root of our political work here in the US and found many commonalities with our counterparts in the occupied territories. What we learned moved us deeply and prompted us to think about how we as feminist scholar activists could raise our voices in opposition to the occupation and the violent militarization of the region, and how we could support Palestinian women and progressive Jewish women who were already involved in this work. As academics and activists who are engaged with multiple issues, one question we had to ask ourselves, even before we went, was why this issue and why now? There are countless instances of oppression, injustice, and inequality that we can point to around the world. But the occupation of Palestine, especially since I went to visit the region, seems to be an absolutely urgent political issue, one that we cannot put on the back burner. It was incredibly clear to us that the crisis in Palestine is compelling for any person of conscience who is concerned with democracy and human rights. I did not go to Palestine looking for evidence of apartheid. I must say, however, I was struck by the parallels to apartheid that I saw. No comparisons are perfect, but the similarities were evident. We didn't see in the West Bank or Israel today what's known as petty apartheid, the whites-only signs, those things that inconvenienced me as a child. But we did see the more substantive components of a system of segregation and hierarchy, unequal citizenship, dispossession of land, land seizures, displacement of a population, the physical segregation of Palestinian and Jewish communities, hierarchy and inequality between Jews and non-Jews in Israel, an identity pass system, the checkpoints, the detentions, imprisonments, and forms of torture, the fragmentation of Palestinian communities that I think are so reminiscent of the apartheid homelands that we know so much about. And together, I think these policies constitute a form of systematic racism and discrimination in law and practice that is not the same as, but can be compared to apartheid in South Africa. And I lived through apartheid in South Africa, so I feel like I can say that with a tremendous amount of confidence. Sort of a few other things in closing, because I really do want to hear from our other speakers. But I came away from that delegation with a firm belief that Palestine has to be a component of any left, feminist, anti-racist social justice struggle. The basis for building a real left movement is not just showing symbolic support, but thinking about the interconnections, about the dependencies, and about the mutual interests. In Israel, as in South Africa, this happens in multiple ways. There is the construction of the racialized other, right? And we have the progressive, forward-looking imperial liberated power. And this construction of the liberated imperial power has a very long history in colonial states. And white South Africa was constructed as very liberal, as very forward-looking, especially on issues of feminism and gender. And we see something very similar happening in Israel, and Sarah Schulman has referred to this as pinkwashing. We also see connections between the military apparatus in the U.S. and Israel, right? There is, of course, material aid that the U.S. sends to Israel. There's a training of U.S. law enforcement by the Israeli police and military, and that came to light several years ago during the Ferguson protests. So those same tactics that are being used on brown and black communities here in the U.S., practices of detention, containment, surveillance, and uses of violence, were actually being learned vis-a-vis the state of Israel. The same companies that are involved in the development of technology and production of weapons that are used against both African Americans as well as Palestinians. And of course, there are American companies that profit from contracts with the Israeli military. And so I don't think we can forget about those multiple interconnections between the state of Israel and the U.S. state and the use of police power here in the United States. An intersectional framework prompts us to examine how white supremacy, global capitalism, settler colonialism, and imperialism, including imperial feminism, operate. And intersectional analysis is evident, of course, in the many links between the movement for Black Lives, a coalition of over 50 Black Lives Matter organizations, and the struggle for Palestinian independence. There was lots of evidence in 2004 during the Ferguson protests of the kinds of solidarity that were going back and forth between residents of Gaza and the protesters in Ferguson. And the Black Lives, and the Movement for Black Lives just last year released a statement in support and in solidarity with their Palestinian brothers and sisters, endorsing the BDS movement. And I will also say we can also see in some of the recent conversations around feminism, right? Arguments being made that a real feminist politics needs to be inclusive and include all forms of feminism, even those that are Zionist. And I don't think you can have a progressive feminist politics that includes support for the state of Israel. Illegal occupation of Palestine is compatible with any form of feminism that I want to be a part of. In the same way that I think that corporate feminism, right, which often uncritically supports the exploitation of poor and working class women, is not the kind of inclusive feminism that I want to be a part of. We need to build an inclusive, anti-imperialist and anti-racist feminism in the same way we need to build an inclusive, anti-imperialist left movement. Thank you.
From Omar, and also because both Nadine and Premilla very eloquently covered some of the stuff that I wanted to talk about. So I'm going to skip through some of what I was planning to say in order to get a little bit more quickly to Omar's talk. But I did want to revisit quickly Nadine's introduction about what happened with this event tonight and the way the administration handled it. And I do want to say that I'm ever in awe with the student organizing that happens here in the face of both students. Press your work. It's really, really inspiring to be here and to see how you persevere. And so I think, you know, I wanted to focus tonight on BDS in the age of Trump and sort of what are we looking at in terms of the political situation right now, what it means for the BDS movement and for all the related movements that so many of us are a part of. And so I do want to just go back over for a minute what Nadine was talking about, the fact that the administration, less than 24 hours ago, shifted the requirements for who could be in this room in order to keep people from the public who wanted to hear, in particular from Omar, who of course is on a temporary lifting of his travel ban, which has been imposed by Israel, and who is a graduate of this university, that there's an attempt to keep people from hearing what he has to say. And I think the rationalization, as Nadine again mentioned, that this change of policy was that there had been national media attention, and what they called national media attention was an article in Breitbart. I think really does in some ways encapsulate what we're looking at in terms of the political conditions that we are facing in this moment. So I want to unpack that a little bit. And also, as Nadine said already, you know, to be sure, Columbia, like so many other colleges and universities in this country, already has a long history of repressing both student and faculty speech in support of Palestinian rights. And again, that same story that you brought up of the banner drop and the way that Barnard, with counter to its own policies with no notice, removed the banner because it was scared of Students for Justice in Palestine hanging a very simple banner that said, stand for justice, stand for Palestine. That was in 2014. So we can't pretend that this started with the Trump presidency. We'd be doing the many, many decades and years of work that people have been doing this work if we pretended that that were so. But that being said, there's no doubt that since the election, extremist right-wing narratives and public figures are being taken dangerously seriously. And Breitbart, which until November was known as a racist, Islamophobic, and anti-Semitic rag that was fringe at best, it still is all of those things. But Steve Bannon, who's the former executive editor of Breitbart, of course, is now the chief strategist at the White House. And the Breitbart ethos has moved right into the heart of US empire, and its spokespeople and followers really feel empowered to act with impunity. So that's a pretty dangerous state of affairs. And Bannon, of course, to go even further, is known as a strong supporter of Israel, and has carried accusations of anti-Semitism by noting that support. Similarly, we have Trump aide Sebastian Gorka, who's been in the news recently. He's going to be appearing in a couple of weeks at a Jerusalem Post conference alongside top Israeli leaders, and he's been unmasked as a supporter and most likely member going back decades of a Hungarian Nazi-like group. And he also, just last week, was in Israel with Sean Hannity. So we have a situation where many mainstream Jewish organizations, groups like the Jewish Federations of North America and APAC, have yet to express any concern about Bannon or Gorka's ongoing empowerment, to say the very least, of anti-Semitic thought, not to mention their and most, if not all, members of the Trump administration's open Islamophobia, racism, and anti-immigrant sentiments and policy proposals. But in a stunning hypocrisy, even as these Jewish groups are silent about actual acts of anti-Semitism and racism, their ongoing attempts to smear the BDS movement and its supporters of anti-Semitic have not ceased. So, to recap, actual anti-Semitism and even Nazi alliances are fine, as long as you support Israel. And to the contrary, BDS, a movement rooted in the most fundamental principles of human rights, is under continual attack as anti-Semitic. So perhaps the most cynical attempt to take advantage of this new atmosphere was the AntiSemitism Awareness Act. That was introduced between the election and the inauguration with the involvement of APAC and the ADL, which is the Anti-Defamation League. It presents itself as a civil rights organization, but has taken in the last several decades its main focus is supporting Israel. This act, this Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, was the culmination of years of effort to redefine anti-Semitism at the federal level to include criticism of Israel as part of its definition. If it had passed, it would have been written into law, at least on campuses, that criticism of Israel would have been defined as anti-Semitic. Thankfully, due to the efforts of a broad coalition of Palestinian rights groups as well as free speech advocates, the bill stalled in the House, though it may still be introduced. This year also saw the introduction of two federal bills in Congress, the Combating BDS Act of 2017 and the Israeli Anti-Boycott Act of 2017, which is following on the heels of several years of effort, again, as Nadine mentioned, mostly during the Obama administration, we should remember, that's resulted in at least 17 state legislatures passing various forms of anti-BDS bills. So, without minimizing the danger of these efforts, I do want to emphasize that the shift to a legislative strategy by our opposition is a sign of weakness. They understand that they are losing the grassroots and pull the very well. In December of 2016, the Brookings Institute, which is hardly even a liberal bastion, found that 60% of Democrats support economic sanctions or more serious action on settlements. And in January, the Pew poll found that Democrats, after 4 decades of decisively favoring Israel over Palestinians, are now evenly split in their sympathies. This shift, which is not yet reflected in our elected officials, is clearly a key reason for the rush to legislate against BDS, which has proven itself to be one of the most effective tactics to change both the public narrative and to move people into action on behalf of Palestinian rights. But let's be real. Besides being unconstitutional, these laws are like shutting the barn door after the horse has bolted. It's just too late. Just as efforts to legislate against gay marriage, for example, just a few years before it became the law of the land, ultimately failed, so too will efforts to fight against a rising tide of public opinion and revulsion against Israeli policies. Israel is acting with impunity, believing its own lunatic extreme right government is in full alignment with our own. And for the moment, they may be right. But it's a hollow and short-term state of affairs because the bipartisan consensus of support that Israel depends on is crumbling. And the multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-faith coalition of people fighting Trump on the broadest array of issues is increasingly putting Palestinian rights squarely within its agenda. That's echoed also in the Jewish community. The Reut Institute, which is closely aligned with the US government, with the Israeli government, hard to keep them apart sometimes, but it's closely aligned with the Israeli government, and in the last several years it's taken on as one of its primary roles, formulating strategy to fight the BDS movement. And it put out a pretty fascinating report last week that's really worth reading in its entirety, but I want to share one short quote here about its assessment of the current US political situation. This is what they said. The political right appears to be growing closer to the state of Israel, while the political left grows more distant. These developments signify the end of both bipartisan support and automatic Jewish support for Israel. For a growing number of diaspora Jews, the state of Israel is not a source of pride, but rather a source of embarrassment and a legitimate object of criticism. And I have to say, quite honestly, I feel no small satisfaction hearing this acknowledgement of the fruits of our work over the last several years. But on a more serious note, of course, the sad reality behind this quote is the ongoing daily repression of Palestinian rights and the curtailing of Palestinian lives. There's no hasbara, which is Israeli propaganda, or any amount of money, even though they're spending tens of millions of dollars to try, that can hide that reality. And as long as it's true, Israel will continue to lose its credibility and support. And I also, again, this is an interesting example of the ways that just random accusations of anti-Semitism that don't really make any sense are trying to be used to fight. Also illustrates what everything I've been saying for the last 5 minutes, so thank you. To go on, once you get past the sort of nauseating particulars of the Trump administration and our current political moment, I do think we have some interesting opportunities, particularly for those of us who are working to transform the American Jewish community, which is the small piece of the movement that my organization, Jewish Voice for Peace, works on. For one, there's space now to open up a discussion about the separation of Zionism with love of the Jewish people. That it's more than possible to be both Zionist and anti-Semitic, and conversely, that those that are anti-Zionist or non-Zionist may be more committed to fighting anti-Semitism than those who are Zionists. And as Premilla described, I think discussions about white supremacy, about feminism, about anti-racism, all of them are increasingly being defined through the prism of your positions on Israel-Palestine, and more this intersectionality, this approach that we need to be consistent with our political values is becoming more and more prevalent as the progressive movement continues to grow and to resist the Trump administration. So I think as broad resistance to the Trump administration has politicized a whole new cohort of people, there's also an increasing opportunity to challenge some long-held blind spots. In the Jewish community, just like in so many other communities, there's been a beautiful flowering of resistance to Trump's policies. The Muslim ban the attempted Muslim ban got people into the streets. But of course, there's been a Muslim ban in Israel for decades. And a Christian ban too, of course, because of Israel's blanket policies against return of refugees and the common refusal to allow Palestinians in the diaspora past the border even for a visit. So this is an opportunity to challenge people to be consistent with their values. Israel doesn't get an out. If you hold certain values for the US, if you don't want to see a Muslim ban in the US, you also have to hold Israel to the exact same standard. So, I think this moment is creating some odd moments. So we had one of the odd spectacles that we saw recently is a couple of weeks ago there was a conference at the UN called the Ambassadors Against BDS, and J Street and U students were sort of very proudly tweeting about how they were going to participate in this conference. And then when they were at this conference, they were called anti-Semitic by some of the completely revolting, very right-wing people who were also invited to the conference that earlier that day they'd been so excited to be at this conference with, and then they made a big fuss about being called anti-Semitic. Now, of course, they shouldn't have been called anti-Semitic, but I'm not sure what they really expected, given that this is where they were positioning themselves and who they're positioning themselves with. So I think this sort of elevated political moment is increasingly forcing everyone to pick sides and to clarify their values. And so which side are you on moment? And so a couple of other things that have happened interestingly into the last couple of weeks since the new ban on BDS activists passed by the Israeli government was passed. There's been two pretty interesting things that happened. One is that Americans for Peace Now, which has historically been a sort of liberal Zionistic group that only engages in settlement boycotts, they canceled their trip to Israel. And the Israeli Studies Association, which is also not a particularly progressive set of scholars, have also said that they will not, they've proactively said they will not visit Israel as long as this ban is in place. So we're seeing some movement in some different and interesting ways, and I think there are opportunities for all of us who are doing this work, again, in particular, in my case, in the Jewish community, to move things forward. And I want to end by just talking about what we can learn from the BDS movement and the movement for Palestinian rights and freedom more generally, which does offer us here, fighting our own fights here, tools and inspiration as we continue these fights. I think if we want to treat Trump's administration as no business as usual, we don't need to look any further than the example offered to us by Palestinians who have long adopted the principle of no normalization by refusing to create a false equivalency between occupier and occupied. What that looks like in practice is encapsulated by the slogan co-resistance, not coexistence, which means not participating in projects with Israelis who aren't actively fighting for full equality and freedom of Palestinians. This stance is often met with strong objections, especially from liberal Jewish groups who call for dialogue. But Charles Blow, on the pages of the New York Times, which of course has not been the best, shall we say, on Israel-Palestine, but Charles Blow is a regular columnist in the New York Times, and talking about the Trump administration, he laid down the gauntlet shortly after the election, and I want to quote him here, I love this quote. He says, "The very idea of sitting across the table from a demagogue who preyed on racial, ethnic, and religious hostilities and treating him with decorum and social grace fills me with disgust to the point of overflowing. Let me tell you here where I stand on your, quote, I hope we can all get along plea. Never." Is a clear articulation for those resisting Trump of why there should be no normalization of those who do not respect basic rights, either in the US or in Israel. To pledge that there be no business as usual is in fact parallel to the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. As these tools gain prominence in the resistance to Trump, the power, potential, and righteousness in using them in the struggle for Palestinian rights can only grow. As we show up for one another, as we fight for our fundamental rights and our future, more and more of us will realize that the fights here and the fights for justice and freedom for Palestinians are actually one and the same. Thanks.